Well, you
Oh,
got it.
they came to our building, and I've decided to do it because we have had a few cases here.
Well, we've had. Well, actually, Janet has gone for 2 weeks to do this marriage and things like that. That is happening with the whole family. A couple of hundred people, I think, are getting together or something. So she left, and then also Spiro left also around 5 in the morning to go out with a friend to that lightning fields. You know the lightning fields. There's a place where this artist put 1,000 lightning rods, and then you can go out there. Most of the artists go out there. He was a pretty famous artist who did it. So most of the artists go out there, and if you're lucky, you see the lightning in the fields. But it's,
Mm.
even if there's no lightning, it's spectacular just the way it's shaped like that, you know.
Yes.
So we were discussing. I think we were discussing hurt as a somehow that one almost is born with a kind of hurt, that one has a historical imperative waiting. What was the other? Um, and where did they say that the somehow that can be transmitted? Um, the thought can be transmitted through time to each body into time, and they found that an experiment, I think, with certain animals that they can that their thoughts can be then transmitted to their grandchildren and their great grandchildren, similar characteristics or flavor or taste or an
Yes.
aversion to a taste,
Mm.
where they created an aversion to a taste. And then somehow that memory is in the grandchildren and the children, not even with growing up with them, but that somehow. So they're finding much of life is coexisting with the form, but the form of all forms seem to represent hundreds of existences within them. And then when you even come to they find out then even within the animals that they're studying, there's hundreds of suggestions, intuitions, elements that are built into the system. That when you look at it, much of it is transmitted not even physically, but is somehow transmitted through time and space, like the history repeating itself or something like that. A kind of repetition is inherently in the form. And yet each time it's happening, it's a new thing. So when there were periods like there are now, when there are authoritarian characters who are defining what the country is or how you should look or how you should be or whatever, coming from tribes or background or circumstance or religions or whatever, how you should act or what should you do. Then you see a person who doesn't come with that history, but just enters into the story, would be a stranger in a strange land because they would be coming from the human into the story. And they would be meeting people with a history who was searching for the very thing that that person was bringing in, the mystery, that they've come from the mystery. To them, the mystery is normal. To them, the history is an adventure. And that's what I mean when we say sometimes that the angel enters into the historical body of something, but for the angel, it would be an experience
Mm.
that would be remarkable. It would be like watching the best movie ever. And yet, for the person who experienced it, it's literalizing it as an experience. But then in retrospect, you see you can access the experiences that you've had and see other dimensions in it that were hidden in plain sight. And so you see that time is a factor, not only in the literalness of carrying on, but it's a factor of revealing the life that you live to you, which probably would have interrupted the circumstance if you reflected on that at the time. So doing at certain times are so strong, the pressure, that in retrospect, you see what was behind the doing and what were you meet yourself. And you see many dimensions. Well, you think you are your history, But then you see your history is not only a literal that you're born in this day and you come from that, but you see a history is also almost has many variations, almost as if it's a film that you admire. You see all the dimensions that are hanging out in the experience. And when you're exposed to that and you re-enter the literal story is affected. You've seen something that has sort of shifted the history of repetition. Now, repetition doesn't always mean literal repetition, although many times it does. But you start to see the repetitive factor on another level, where someone cared for you and then it was a shared experience.
Yeah.
So you visit yourself. And that happens usually what appears to be an accident. But again, the accident that comes out of where you know music, you know the sound, and you're frustrated in a level, the frustration itself is part of the creative process, you see. Although still, it's an honest experience that's happening, not something to be gotten rid of or anything like that. In the creative process, the frustration, the failure, the dynamics, all of those are part of the movie that one is in. But when you see that there is an underlying hurt that then aligns itself with that is hurt for reasons, that your mother did this, your uncle did that to you, and that, all of those are relevant within the literal story. But when there is a moment in your life when you see the spiritual story without it being overdrawn, where you see the other dynamic that was in your life all along, you see all the elements were somehow written into an experience that one had. What it meant to be alive in this place, what it meant to assume an identity, what it meant to navigate all the forms. And when you can view all the lives that you've lived, from childhood to all the different dimensions, and you can see a common thread running through the story, while you try to intuit it in the living day, while you try to have images of a kind of coexistence, there is one perspective that one has looking back at the story where you see it from the audience, and you see to be able to see one's inner life and the life they've lived is a religious experience. Without the hype, without the shtick, religious meaning not in the normal logical circumstance, but you see a dimension of your life where you understand all the elements. It could even be called holy shit, because it has elements where one was completely out of their own existence while it was being lived. And one sees it in retrospect and meets one's own life for the first time in a way that is not structured or shtick. And it usually happens through some issue that causes a stopping of the status quo and a deeper reflection. And so therefore, when there's a deeper reflection, it has nothing to blame. When it has nothing to blame, there's another level of reflection that takes place. Because then it starts to perceive that somehow written in its life is this moment. Okay. So as it starts to experience that, it sees that its life was not only past life or future life, but you're somehow visiting time from a different place. Just like, as I say, you're seeing in a creative play or a movie where you see they can do 200 years in 20 minutes and fly through time. You see that you've always been able to fly through time, but now it's awakened. And I think that when it's awakened, the story is forgiven from its karma. It is no longer bound by its history. Now you awaken to a fact of mystery. And then you also see the absolutely, what would look like dumbness of the situation. Boy meets girl, has a baby. They don't really mesh together as people, but the baby is what they wanted. So you start to see a historical premise a creative premise that history is not the dominant factor, that somehow life found a way to navigate. Life found a way to get out of what became a psychological prison, meaning to be structured deeply with someone you didn't deeply love and they didn't share that with you. But they had to do it, and you had to do it, so that having to do it had an underlying violence that running through it. Unless it's perceived in a conversation, what having to do it is not a gun to your head, is being there for something that you created. Okay. So when there is a moment when you meet the many lives that you've had within the one life, you're seeing something that is avoided generally, because it interferes then with the literal, the status quo. It then opens up life as a creative expression. And work may be an aspect of it, but normally work is a normal aspect of living, not so much literally a job. And that's why making music or writing or whatever is not so literally a job, because there are certain insights that come to you at any time of the day or night or in circumstance or whatever. So you kind of are working with a parallel time where past, present, and future all are there for you to explore. But when you have that, it's a privileged state, because then you see the thing happening. What you took for granted is a normal situation when you see your kids and this and that. When you see them at a certain point from the perspective of the art of the life, there's a holy shit moment. You see the remarkable creative depth that you've been in, that somehow you navigated this life through all its ups and downs or whatever, and had the children that was inherently there. So I'm not attempting to polish it up, because the movies don't need polishing. They need to stand on their own. But when you see the life from the creative perspective, the literal story is somehow released. There's an aha moment of why you went through all this crap and what happened and what, because they would say, why did you do this? Why would, and you see in retrospect, even though it may have been literally dumb in the literal world, it was in fact a creative move. And it was based on the smallest of affections or friendships or feelings that opened up a doorway. And then as it literalized, then there are issues that come into the picture that are challenging as the story literalizes. But you also see that the underlying creative thread is still running through it. At the same time that the people literally surviving may have lost contact with that thread. Somehow there's a relationship to the thing that allowed it to be connected in the first place. So I feel that when you start to see the elements running through the life, you see those elements that running through the life are inherently free. Free, and that they're exploratory elements. And you see that when one perceives those elements in oneself, one's life kind of becomes exploratory. Meaning a kind of flux perceived, not as an enemy, not as a threat, but flux as the norm in life. But you also see creatively the challenge when one starts to move from flux, and you have literal rent money, and you have rent to pay and this to pay, and the literalness of life. You see the challenging issues that will come creatively, where somehow you need to be free to explore. And sometimes you live in a literal world that's based on a money scene that keeps you grounded. And then you meet a duality, not in a fight, because they recognize each other. And in the kind of recognition in it, what would have been a fight or create psychic problems is released from the story. You see that one's life is also a cooperative, not a competitive.
Yeah.
So anytime any aspect of life is awakened, it's free from slavery. Anytime you reflect on your life and or you even start to research its history or past, or it frees it from the slavery of continuity by giving you a creative perspective into the story. And sometimes if you see a past of yourself from a different perspective, there's a holy shit moment. And so you, at one point, of course, it's still literal. Of course, there is a literal time zone that we live in that we know how to negotiate. But somehow now, from perception, we're in it, but not of it. And in it, but not of it means that you're no longer hooked or addicted to the accomplishments, the money that's waiting out there, the this or the that or whatever, that somehow a kind of creative freedom is the essential factor for you now that you perceive a parallel dimension in your life. To perceive a parallel dimension in your life was running there all along while you've been living literally, is to enter something sacred with that perception. So you see something holy running through the story that you care for. Once that is awakened, where you see that there's an intimate, that through the whatever Meshuggah life is happening, you see intuitively a life running through it that has a certain, one cares for that. One speaks to that. One is related to that. So you see an essence. And then when you see an essence, you bring that essence into the story with you. So even simple relationships then start to share an essential factor. When the relationship starts to develop around the essential factor, there's something almost religious in the interaction. And religious not being a possession of religion, but the feeling of that would be hidden in religion is inherently there in the love feeling, in the sharing from a deeper space. Whoosh, we just took a flight there for a moment.
Nice.
A sacred flight.
Well, it seems, but also everyday existence at the same time, you know, so that's why I was looking at this picture of Einstein with the Indians again, you know. You see he's wearing the Indian headdress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see that? Yeah. And that's his, I guess that was his wife at the time. And then there's a kid that he's holding, and he's holding a pipe. He's holding a pipe with the little board next to him there. And, but then he's got that other scientist that may be pissed off. Let me see. Can you see? Let me see. Do you see him over there? On the right-hand corner?
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yes. So, so he must, I don't know, that Einstein would wear the headdress and carry the pipe and hold a little kid in his hand and and go up to the Pueblo. And they were having a big fight around that time also about the, what do you say, relativity versus, or not versus, but as it was becoming, what do you say? Do you know, Derek, what the arguments were around that time?
You're talking about general relativity, and then I guess also the quantum mechanics that Bohr.
Yeah, quantum. So Einstein was resisting. So he and Bohm would have long conversation, not Bohm.
Bohr.
What was his name? Bohr, yeah. Had long conversations, but then Einstein relented, I think. And following their conversations, in fact, it's in nice book to get, is the 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, right?
By Carlo
It's the same fellow, Carlo Rovelli, yeah.
I got that book.
You got the other book? I did too.
It's really good.
Well, you know, he writes really well.
Yes.
And he also, in this small book, he writes really well. And it's as if you're at home with everyone. As we talk here in conversation, as if you're at home with people. And it's the friendliness that kind of cuts through all the stories or whatever and the differences. And so then you start to see the friendship is more revelatory as to what's happening. It's a shared space. So then they understand with each other, between themselves, how to convey it to the public or to the situation, but they're all bringing a dynamic to the moment. And so what they're exploring and what they're teaching is in fact inherently happening in their lives. They see it, so they have arguments around it and agreements around it. But in fact, their life is a kind of physics
Mm.
and acknowledged as such.
Mhm.
Hmm? Now, it may be that from my looking at many of the tribal religions and religious thoughts, it looks as I don't see that much of a difference between religious thought and Einstein's theories. You know, in some way, they seem to resemble hidden factors that you had to study and devote yourself to before it was exposed. And then you see almost it had to be accident before you discovered hidden factors in there. And you also saw if you studied religious things or whatever, there would be crises that would happen to you if you were serious about it. Because then if you were serious about it, it wasn't to use these religious thought, it was to really see what was happening or to explore. So when you had a life that was then exploration, whatever level it was on,
Mm.
if you were thrown into exploration because the circumstance you're in shifted, and so there was always a mystery, you didn't have a steady life or something, or the life didn't have a literalness for you.
Yeah.
And you were in flux. That flux is also a journey. Because then you kind of, you start to see in retrospect that the life that you had resembled almost a scientific theory. Everything that happened to you then seems to almost be applied physics. Is that possible, Derek, that one can then master something in time and then have a reflection, not, they see that time is not the past, like literal time, but that time, the past is also there, there's an impression within one that carries the time. And when that impression is bumped or touched or seen or perceived, it throws one back, it can throw one back 30 years or 20 years in memory. But it's pre-existing somehow. Somehow it's not the past. Even though it is the past that you're referring to, it is not literally the past. There's something inherently ticked off in the brain that is related. And then you see memory opens up a whole parallel life that you knew all along, but you see elements of suppression and structure. In order to carry on, you see suppression is one of the aspects of survival. But when survival is no longer the dynamic where your thought is organized around survival, and what is survival in our framework is make a buck. So the buck or the dollar is the survival medium and basically how you're measured. So even the secret people who are running the place are because they have a big buck or so on. So they supposedly have a secret society where they're pulling all the pulleys and running the place supposedly. But as you then start to see, then there's no longer a literalness in it. You see the flux that's running through the story. And somehow it frees you from the literalness of the story. You see that those who are supposedly the biggest powerful dudes didn't have that much of a background or history, that much of them came out of an accident or a girlfriend or a boyfriend or something like that, who introduced them to this. And so then you start to see, well, what is their people? And when you get into a conversation personally with them, they expose themselves as being people. Not this or that or magnets or that. That comes with the story. It would be even if you were in the room with George Washington alone, you would start to see, okay. And then you see if you were in if you met even Jesus alone in a room, and the conversation or the hanging out as if it was normal. would be a shared space. And so you see everything in the shared space would have that spiritual element to it once that element was the basis of the connection. Then the hanging out was a transmission. It wasn't literal teaching. There was a sense transmitted.
No, I like that.
And so then that also became, when people attempted to find out how to translate the how to, then they introduced Shaktipat ideas throughout time, was that someone in that space can transmit the energy to another if they're on the same frequency and they're seeking. And there was a variable in the seeking. If the person was seeking the same breakthrough perceptively, but if they were just seeking more money or better seed or this or that, there were different chakra degrees of what the person was bringing in their request. But if the person was bringing a request to see deeply, that made a mirror of the teacher. The teacher was kind of mirroring the desire of the person and can only reach that level based on the desire of the person. But if the person desired a breakthrough perceptively, meaning a perceptive breakthrough actually changes the course of the life because it's probably working on many levels. So when that desire is deeply there, that desire then brings to the interaction a dynamic of a mirror effect. When the desire is therapeutic, when the desire is simply better or to make more money or to have all of these things. But if in fact there is a yearning that is not captured by the psyche or owned by the psychological, then there is a breakthrough inherently in the circumstance, I feel, that once the desire is perceived.
That's nice.
Because then you see the whole thing was only around Shaktipat. Once you perceive the Shaktipat, it has been there in everything that you've been doing, whether it's recognized or not. And you see that once the feeling for it is there, it exists, and as it shifts, you start to see things shift. And it's not exactly a question of fixing it up or doing that or anything. It's there's a work in progress. There's an unfolding process. I feel that at one point, our everyday life of just people, when you perceive it, you also see the creative process that's happening in the life. And then you start to see what holy means in a different sense, without it being captured by organized religion. You start to see holiness is in your everyday life. And it's just part of the expression. So then while you are having a literal life, that other element is also entered into the story. And so at that point in time, for most of us here, we'll find ourselves caring for something in relationship with others. The others may or may not know that fully. With those who kind of share it fully on that basis, where the relationship itself is a creative act. But then generally the caring is what you'll probably be known for. And whether that will be your children or your friends or your this or that, they will look to you for that space. And once caring becomes very much a motif of your life, you'll start to explore dimensions of caring. Because it's happening naturally for you that you can go into a situation. It's happening naturally for us now that someone can come in dying and we can just take care of them and okay, like that, as if it's normal or whatever. And it is normal. The only thing, it also has to be not true literally, but in fact, when you are meeting with dying and living as normal, as part of the friendly, when you wave at each other and and there's a kind of, hey, baby, how you doing? Dying and living is in the story. And it's a wink, a hello, or what's up, or this or that. And now you're meeting folks where that, in fact, is inherently in the story. So you see, holy shit is in the everyday life. Whereas sometimes you can hear the news or hear something literal that sounds like absolute crap. How could they go for it? And yet you see you're inhabiting a space that's not, you're in it, but you're not of it that way.
Yes.
That somehow, when there is a sense of something creative happening in your life, you're no longer organized into the world in the same way. So survival isn't your main ingredient. And so when it's not your main ingredient, you won't be able to kill for it, do all these, only because there's an absurdity to it. Once you come into the place from the human perspective and assume the identity of the story, you're coming from a different place than the identity is coming from. The identity is coming from continuity, survival, structure. The being is not coming from roles. Those are, again, the Uber driver elements of the story. I think that the being is coming from a journey. And it assumes different identities for different experiences. But when I look back at it, they were different movies, but the same thread ran through them.
Yeah.
There was a mystery going through the history. And when you looked, reflected back, some incident forced you to reflect back. And it sometimes had to force you to reflect back. Not with a gun to your head or something, but then you saw something or read something that opened up that hidden passage in your being. And it reflected back. And you saw how many dimensions coexisted with you when you don't own the story. So the owner of the story has a specific dialogue that's happening. But when it looks back, it sees that the story was always part of a larger creative act. Always. The discovery of that changes the venue. Because then it changes. You die before you die. You live while you're living. You somehow illuminate the very dimensions that are happening unconsciously in you. Once it's illuminated, the unconscious no longer rules in that way. That's what I'm experiencing now, where it brings it into the everyday story. How does that sound? Is anyone on else with us, or?
Jimmy's here. Let's see.
Okay.
There are a couple people watching, but I don't know who, but Jimmy is here.
Okay. Hi, Jimmy. Hope he's doing okay. Let me see. Well, there's Mary here, also working in her shop. So it's been pretty quiet. It'll be quiet now. Most of the folks have left. So it's just Brenda here and the young man working out there now. So it'll be quiet for a few days. What do you think? It's also quiet for you? Is your daughter still visiting there, Erja?
No, she has been gone, since after Mother's Day.
So she's still living in Holland?
No, she's in Oregon.
Oh, she's in Oregon. What's happening there? Is there a community?
Well, she has someone who she trained a long time ago and who is also one of her good friends, has a Pilates studio. So she invited Lara to come and teach there.
Well, that's nice, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
And okay for her. Yeah. So is she finished with Europe, or she still will go back there?
I don't.
Yeah.
I don't. So,
No, it's like us. Also, there's no literal plans. Yeah. Actually, the life is more up in the air. So then it's a kind of grounding with having a friend somewhere where you can visit and hang out.
Yes.
But basically, you're earning and you're keeping it together. So it looks okay that most of us somehow have a kind of, even though we're broke, It's not poor. You know what I mean? And you see that the lives that everyone is living is not exactly poor at all, you know. But it's so there's a difference between brokenness. I think broke is a creative aspect when you're relating. But poor, coming from poor, is when you're poverty oriented, it dominates the survival awakens. Broke is more of a, it's more, it comes with a creative life. You know, where then you kind of have to put something together, or this has to, but you see, you have to enter into the story creatively to, where money is something different. It is no longer always a ruler or a commander, but you see a creative process in it. And in fact, when you look at your life, you see that somehow you've survived all these. What was the philosophy again, Ursula? How did you get into 82 years? What did you do? So let's say, and it could be eight years also. It could be, okay, it could be any years that you have. So you see that somehow you did Ursula. And then you meet the past and the future and the present, where it's not so much the past, but it's a relationship. And it's normal, even though if you reflect on the experience,
Yeah.
can you imagine then, Kai meeting your daughter 40 years from now and hanging out, and God, you say, what the hell happened then? And you say, I don't know, you know, I thought this was going on, but you actually have a conversation that's impossible in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And
I was watching,
yeah.
I was watching my daughter do the dishes today, and I had that vision of sitting in her house when she's older, sitting on her couch watching her do the dishes.
And you say, what happened, mommy? I don't know. You were in Pennsylvania. So let's say, I don't know. Actually, I think in Hebrew, I don't know is the name of God. Adonai. I don't know. So the I don't know is a deep, deep, challenging question in the creative process of life. Not just a way of shrugging it off. But I don't know is that there are certain dimensions in the existence that are not just based on literal knowledge.
Yes.
But come more from an immersive, where you stop what you're doing to some degree and you look.
Mm.
And that looking then
Yeah.
interrupts the status quo. And in reflecting on it, it introduces you to a dimension that's happening for you all along. But that something had to stop you in your tracks to some extent, where you had to reflect, and the reflection opened up a doorway that was parallel all along, but could only be perceived by a certain kind of feeling or mindset. And so it looked like it came through accident. But then you also see in the philosophical framework, accident, like in the creative thing, accident is not exactly accident. Once you're creatively in the picture, and you come to a certain issue that's stuck or whatever, what looks like an accident, but unplanned, unforeseen, unmanaged. So it looks like it appears, something comes in and reflects a happening in the creative process. That's what one must seemingly almost exhaust themselves literally in attempting to capture the sound or capture the feeling. Because it's not around capturing, and I think it's, but it is around the surrendering of the normal forms of ownership. When the creative process comes into it, you start to feel a relationship with another dimension. Mm-hmm. And once you feel a relationship with another dimension, that becomes your reality. Mm-hmm. Because you see inherently in the life, there's a creative dialogue happening. And when you're in that space, you're sharing it. When that is not happening, then there is a yearning that awakens.
Yes. Yes, there is.
So let's say that there's a life being lived within one's life, and you discover it. We've made up a religion around it, we've made up views around it, we've made up philosophies around it, but there's a life living within our life. And that you then start to see dimensions of your own existence. And so one of them was to live literally, but the other then seems to have lived to have the experience of living. And in that, you see, once it had the experience of living, it then took on different shapes and different forms. So one's history was not exactly a duplication, but one's history was, you can see times when it would shift and this would go into that one. So you would see very different expressions, even though the same person was there. They set up a body of experiences. And the body of experiences, even though they were normal, very just relationships, you see relationship can take you through the whole body of hurt, loss, betrayal. It would be even worse than war sometimes. You see some relationships took you through the whole experience. And you stuck with it, and you fought to stay there, you fought to have it. And so you start to see there were elements in the life, that there was an experience that one had to have somehow. And it took the form of a structural experience outwardly, but you see something had to break before it can go. Something had to shift. You see the creativity in your own life. And then you see the accidents that happen, what appear to be the accidents that happen, or the situations that took place. You see, Urja, you could have never gotten Stephen, but then all of a sudden, Laura comes into the story and he says, sure, here's a house, here's a this, come on, why don't you come over? And all of a sudden, so let's say Laura has to fly by to awaken a conversation again. But then the conversation that we have between us is no trip.
Yeah.
No trip. The relationship is not a possessive, it's a creative act. So when we meet, there's no trip that we have for each other. It's just, and I say, why? I say, because it's not around survival, it's around the shared life. And the shared life has a sense of it. So let's say that from my perspective, you were able to enter into the literal story and affect it on a lot of levels. Over nothing, just people having a deep yearning in their life.
But then,
Deep yearning, even though they're very different people and very different circumstance, you see there's a certain similarity to the yearning.
but there is an element of getting high on it.
Yes.
I mean, like flying, and then I'm going through the phase of experiencing grief, missing my son. It's like, whoo, after the big flying over.
Yeah, no flying over. You
I
get
plunged.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay, so go ahead. You fly over. Okay, and you're there. Then you plunge. Give me a plunge.
But I must say, even
So let's say, no,
inside
you understand the plunge comes to you only under certain conditions.
yes.
I can't say to you, why can't I say to you, let me see the plunge you're talking about?
Ooh.
That's not such a big plunge.
Well, I have a table there. Woo.
How about So plunge, let's say what you're having is a conversation.
Yeah.
And it's no longer a literal conversation, but you're having a visitation. Now you can get a visitation that says, you dirty French old bastard, why didn't you take care of me and give me milk when I was a little baby? And you say, oh, that ain't the conversation that I'm having. So the conversation is not in the body anymore, and it's not in the history any longer. So then it seems to me that when it's no longer in the history and it's no longer in the body, the conversation that you're having is not of this world. It is a certain kind of temperament for you to have, that you're having a conversation and it's not something that's being punishing you.
Yeah, right.
It's in fact but at the same, you may feel punished because of certain trips that happen in the situation and blame the story. But you see, it ain't the story that's speaking to you. It's the essence of the story. So it's mommy, not mother jumper. There's a difference between, hey, mommy, how you doing? And you old mother jumper, I should give you a bite on your nose. Okay. So it's not coming from ego.
Yeah.
Inside the story, there's ego. In the ghost, there's not a literal ego. It's revelatory. When you see the ghost of the story, even though it's a pain, it's no longer around hiding and sleeping, it's around meeting yourself.
Yeah.
And so therefore, you see, you did mother, but the life was always spiritual. You took on that shape and this shape and whatever shape you had to do. They don't like the shape you took. You understand? And I understand. Maybe you took a lot of weird shapes. But basically, I've met your kids and they're pretty cool. And the boy was going to do what he was going to do. You knew that always. And you were proud of that too. At the same time, you were scared shit of that. So we've lived a life. Look at my girl. Look at my girl. They couldn't get her to go to a doctor. I could even see almost like Kai. If Kai lying there and they say, go get vaccinated, Kai. And they say, no, come on. And she says, no. And I could see her lying there for 3 days. Her body will deal with it. She'll work with. So then I can see Michelle when the boyfriend tried to get her to get out and go to the doctor or whatever. That, in fact, she probably ordered Thai food. So the hip, what would look like, I would guess she had a milieu that she moved in. And looking cool was part of the milieu, and doing your own thing was part of it. And it looked like a big crowd from the pictures that were sent to me or whatever. But they were going to do their thing. They were going to do their lifestyle, their music, and it wasn't dumb. It was pretty brilliant in many elements of it. But if you tried to go in and shift it or change it, you would find yourself in it somehow. For me to see it in absentia was to see, holy shit, I didn't realize how deep it was, and it had similar expressions going back into our past and so on. So you meet the story, and you also meet your boy. And you meet your boy, and where he's not your boy, but he's something that opens up a doorway of reflection that would be almost impossible without the memory of him. And you see the memory of him running through the literal story in the family. So you see your daughter also carries a similar element, and the history and the mystery simultaneously happening, where you visit your family in ways where you didn't get along with them, but all of a sudden in memory, you visit a different experience. So let's say the physical form contains some of an experience. It's released and forces you to reflect on something that was hidden in plain sight. And then you meet your own story.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we call it a day? Shall we? Oh, hi. How are you doing? Is everything okay? Look at this, what this guy made.
There's a big black spider apparently that she wants me to take outside.
Oh,
Okay.
how big? How big is it?
That's it. Can't
Oh,
be that big.
This is big.
It is.
It is.
Yeah.
That's really big.
Okay. Okay, let's say bye-bye anyway, so you can take care of the spider, okay? Okay, everyone, it's been very sweet just hanging out here, okay? And I'll see you tomorrow night then, Derek.
Sounds good.
Thank
Is
you,
that okay,
Danny.
Kai?
You, Daniel.
Yes,
Yeah, sure, take
we'll
care.
go deal with the spider.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye-bye then.
Bye, everybody.